Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dr. Kate Balestrieri, and this is the Get Naked with Dr. Kate podcast. Today, I'm super excited. My guest is Dr. Brendan Kwiatkowski, and he is a researcher, educator, and really kind of just all over badass human who focuses on the social, emotional development and well-being of boys and men and how that intersects with the well-being of others. Dr. Brendan's PhD research investigated teenage boys' experiences and beliefs about being male, and then compared their experiences based on their levels of emotional expression. Dr. Brendan is really passionate about positive and person-centered research that humanizes and empowers people, and his practice is called Remasculine. And in it, he invites boys and men to value and embrace their authentic emotions, to connect with community, to humanize and empower other people. And today we're going to talk about how all of that relates to incel culture and masculinity. So welcome, Dr. Brendan. Thank you for being here. It's time to get naked with Dr. Kate. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Balestrieri, a Beverly Hills-based psychologist, certified sex therapist, and the founder of Modern Intimacy, a national therapy group. So let's dive into all things sex, relationships, mental health, and answer your questions with practical solutions and real answers. Each week, I'll share insights to help you build a healthy relationship with yourself, with other people, and with your sexuality. It's time to start thriving authentically. So let's get naked. And if you like this podcast, hit the download button so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to leave 5 stars and a review. I've been really excited to talk with you about your work with boys and men and understanding their emotional process and their social movement in the world. What can you tell us about how you got into this work and what you've been finding?
Yeah, so I was a high school teacher near Vancouver, Canada, and they were really desperate, and they still are, for teachers specializing in special education. So I did my master's in special ed, really started being interested in students diagnosed with emotional and behavioral disorders, and found that that is the category that teachers have the most bias towards. So
Mm,
they're the least wanting, well, they're the least they feel the least prepared, and that students with emotional behavioral difficulties cause the most problems in the classroom. And then I came across a stat that in the United States, 81% of students diagnosed with emotional behavioral disorders are male. And that was like the interruption of the gender piece. I was like, I used to be a biology teacher and a history teacher. And I was like, oh, how much is socialization? How much is the biology?
mhm.
And went into the research about that. And we could get caught in the reeds about all of those things, but definitely a huge, significant body of research highlighting that socialization pressures at least exacerbate, if
Mhm.
not create, a lot of these differences. And maybe in some cases, boys are overdiagnosed and girls are underdiagnosed. But that was kind of my intro into researching masculinity as a concept. And then there's a saying that all research is me search, which I have retroactively or retrospectively realized as well. Just growing up at a young age within the church, lots of very strong gendered messages. I think my first like memory of gender being a concept was when my church had like a bulletin every Sunday about like what were the songs, who were the pastors, and I just noticed that every time it was a children's pastor who was a male, they were called children's pastors, but then if they were a woman, they were called children's coordinators. I just remember asking my mom, "Oh, why are they coordinators and not pastors?" And at the church that I was at, it was like, "Oh, women can't be pastors." And so, yeah, that's like a very early memory I have of gender. But yeah, just being parts of sports culture growing up. Me and my cousin, my best friend, we always would do things the manly way to challenge each other to do something harder. So it's been a part of my life unconsciously for a really long time. And then when I started researching it, that brought my unconscious into my conscious understanding of how much gender and masculinity has been a part of my life.
Yeah. The construct of gender and specifically masculinity has been has been a part of your life. I really appreciate how you're bringing in that reality that gender is a concept, it's a construct. It's not something that is inherent, right? We create a lot of the definition of what it means to be a man or a woman based on what Based on what? What have you been finding in your research?
Yeah, well, something that's like there's a lot of ways to be a man, and I'm someone who loves Lord of the Rings, and I often, not often, but sometimes when talking to teenage boys who also like Lord of the Rings, it's a helpful example of just like there's so many males in that cast, but it's like who's the best man, who's the most masculine, and you can have like different opinions, but at the same time, it's like the hero of that story is the gardener that like Tolkien meant to be the hero is Sam, and there's just like I think that's often a helpful thing to be like, oh, there's not just one way to be a man. There's a lot of ways to be a man. But in my PhD research of teenage boys, there was definitely still an impression that like, yes, the society's changing. There's more ways to be a man, but I'd say around half the boys that I talked to, roughly, still said like, yes, things are changing, but at the end of the day, girls still want a big burly man who's emotionally stoic and these sort of things. So they still very much have an idea of what the respected or the type of masculinity that's on a pedestal is still very paramount, even though a lot of them are noticing that changing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting. In all of my work with women, that is rarely what they say they want. But it does seem like men are conditioned to believe that. And I think inherent in that observation is the reality that men are also really socialized to cater to the male gaze. And this is what many men are told is the ideal. And they're told that by other men as much as they are anything else. What are some of the beliefs and behaviors associated with masculinity that might fit your understanding of what is called toxic masculinity, but in academic literature is also referred to as precarious masculinity? Like what are some of the behaviors that you identified that really seem to be damaging to men or the people around them?
I use a term of restrictive masculinity, but the
Mm-hmm.
three things that I would point to in the research that would say like are the most harmful beliefs um, are the need to suppress your emotions,
Mm-hmm.
um, the need to be physically dominant, as well as the need to do things yourself, be self-reliant. And those aren't all equal in terms of like, as a teacher, as an educator, like we actually want students to be self-reliant, to learn how to be independent learners and all these other things. So it's like in moderation, like being self-reliant at certain times is like super helpful. It's super great. Where it gets problematic in that case is when you like can't ask for help from others, where you think you need to do everything yourself. And this fuels what like I think is a pandemic of loneliness
Mm-hmm.
in our society in general, but also among boys and men particularly. And we talk about the incel community. That's a huge aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then going back to emotional suppression, which I do think people often conflate emotional stoicism with emotional suppression. I think there's some nuance there, but like to actually shut down and suppress your emotions, that is correlated and to so many like heart disease, so many negative health outcomes physically, as well as the detriment of interpersonal relationships within intimate partner relationships or not. And I know a lot of people think that's the opposite. It's like, no, I shut down my emotions to help my relationships with other people. But that's not what the research shows. And there's so much more to prize apart there. And you as a psychologist, you probably see this so much in your couples
Yeah.
therapy. And then the third one, like the need to dominate or the need to physically assert dominance over other people. There might be an argument to be made that like, well, I guess like the Jordan Petersons of the world make this argument that like a man has to be dangerous in order to be good. Like you have to be in touch with your danger. A harmless man is not safe. Like you have to know your own danger is often what is said. You need to know yourself, what you're capable of. But like the research on like if you feel like you need to dominate other people, I don't think there's tons of redemptive aspects to that. There was some boys in my research who were like they felt that fighting back to the bullying they received was a way for them to keep their power. Like they felt like, you know what, even though I got beat up so many times throughout these years, like I always fought back. And some of them felt like that was protective of themselves. So I want to honor maybe that experience of it. But generally speaking, I'm not going to defend the need to dominate others as being helpful at all. So the need to suppress emotions, the need to dominate others, and the need to do everything yourself, I would say, are the three most limiting and harmful aspects of masculinity. And I call them restrictive because I use that term as when it places restrictions on how you are or how other people are. So you restrict what other people can be, and that would be my understanding or the framework I use to discuss masculinity.
I really love that reframe because it's so clear and descriptive in terms of how it really limits people, especially men, from their own humanity. And all of the things that you just described really do keep men so stuck and so isolated, not only in their emotional process, but from, as you said, being able to ask for help. And it's dangerous for them to be so alone. It's dangerous for anyone to be so alone and to be so stifled in their emotional understanding of themselves. You really poignantly pointed out that there's a huge difference between stoicism and suppressing your emotions. How would you describe that difference? It is, as you so astutely mentioned, one of the biggest complications when I work with men in therapy. They have a hard time accessing their emotions because they're so practiced at stuffing them and disconnecting from them. And for a lot of the men who I work with, they believe that they're being stoic, but they're not. And it's a jump to sort of get them to understand that. So how would you characterize the difference between the two?
Yes, and I want to just credit my supervisor from the University of Edinburgh, Dr. Gillian McCluskey, because I was using emotional stoicism. It's used very heavily in the literature as well about masculinity. And then she's like, Brendan, you should stop using this. Like stoicism has like this rich tradition and
Mm-hmm.
history with it, and like this is different. And I was like, yeah, you're totally right. And so like Marcus Aurelius is often considered one of the main people of Stoicism. And they were debating the same discussion we're having right now in that day because people thought that he was suppressing his emotions by not being moved by your environment. And Hugh didn't think that was what was going on. So, like, that debate was still going on hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago. And how I would decide the difference between Stoicism and suppression is that Stoics with the philosophy, you don't suppress the emotional experience. You observe the emotional experience. You observe like what's like in your body, what's coming up for you, which is huge aspects of emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And the huge thing with stoicism is in, I guess, being patient in your actions that you take from your emotional environment.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas emotional suppression is don't feel anything, something comes up, I'm not going to be impacted by it. You deny the emotional experience
Mm-hmm.
or you pretend to deny the emotional experience. You can't fake your body into suppressing it. You can fake yourself into thinking you're suppressing it, but that is living somewhere in your body, in your nervous system, that will lead to dysregulation elsewhere at other times. And so emotional stoicism is actually paying attention to your emotional state. Emotional suppression is denying your emotional state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I sort of liken the stoicism to mindfulness in a way because you are observing the emotion. You're not reacting to it. You're just like saying, there it is. And I can understand what that is. And I don't have to do anything with it. In fact, I can let it dissipate and move on. And I think that's a huge skill to be developed. And it's one that young boys are often unconsciously and sometimes consciously deprived of because they're told not to feel. Don't act like a girl. They hear, don't cry, don't do these things, don't, be a man, toughen up. And so they're not really given a lot of education about how to make friends with their emotional process and just let it be
Mhm.
something that informs them. And I think they, under the mistaken label of stoicism, are taught to suppress their emotions and just not feel, right? Because feeling is something that a lot of men are told is really bad, but we know it's just so natural. It's part of the human experience, regardless of biological sex or gender.
Absolutely. And the teenage boys in my research, the language they use to talk about their emotions are like these are negative emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And what are they referring to? Fear and sadness primarily. And like having that slant on your emotions, if you think some of them are negative, that also fuels in their perception of why aren't they sharing with people? They don't want to bring other people down. So one of the
Mm-hmm.
main reasons why these teenage boys didn't want to share in my research was people have enough problems of their own. They don't need my problems to add on to them. And that was connected to their masculine belief that you need to be the shoulder to cry on, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, unfortunately, a lot of that messaging gets like emotions gets demonized, particularly like all humans experience the wide spectrum of emotions. And
Mm-hmm.
so the sadness aspect of it really gets demonized. And like, as Dr. Brene Brown says, you can't selectively numb emotions.
Yeah.
So if you numb your sadness, you're also limiting the extent to which you can feel joy and things like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm. It's so true. It's so true. So let's kind of shift into how some of this might become a foundation for boys to gravitate into incel culture. Well, let's first define what it means to be an incel and then talk about how that culture is developed and how everything that we're talking about really feeds into it. So, how do you define incel?
The expression of incel comes from involuntary celibate,
Mm-hmm.
which is don't want people who want to be having sex with women, but aren't for some reason. However, the
Mm-hmm.
term is basically a self-identified term. Like you identify yourself as an incel. It's not like if you're single and don't want to be single, it's not like that makes you an incel by any means. But people who identify as an incel have a particularly bleak outlook as to why they're in that position. They have a huge amount of blame and misogyny, and sexism towards women,
Mm-hmm.
um, towards chads, which are the ideal masculine men who take all of the girls. The incels do not like it being called a movement, because they don't. That would indicate that there's some unified sense, whereas a lot of them, 95% of them, in fact, refer to themselves as black pilled, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term.
Mm-hmm.
It's very nihilistic. So in the spaces of gender, like there's red pill, um, which is basically like feminism hasn't been everything it's cracked up to be. There's actually so much looks based hierarchy that matters. So red pill is like, okay, feminism has not helped. And at the end of the day, girls still want this masculine guy. And so in the red pill community, this is generic. It's like a bit more pickup artists of
Mm-hmm.
like all the things you can do to get the girl. Objectification, of course, happens in those communities
Mm-hmm.
as well. But the growing trend is that the red pill space is kind of dying off, at least among people who call themselves incels, and it's going to black pill, which is like, oh, there's not even a chance anymore that like I'm gonna go completely nihilistic, that there's no hope for a man like me. People who are incels or call themselves incels tend to overestimate the impact that looks and
Mm-hmm.
money have on your dating chances, and they underestimate personality.
Mm-hmm.
And so they think of themselves as, yeah, there's no game to play anymore. There's no hope. So hopelessness is a huge thing. And here's where I can connect with my research. But I'll give the floor to you if you have any questions from there.
No, that aligns with my definition. I think the hopelessness piece is really important, and that hopelessness contributes to a lot of resentment and embitterment and eventually entitlement, right? That kind of forms the bedrock of the mindset within the incel community. We can come back to what you're saying.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think entitlement happens like far earlier in the cycle, but I'm teaching university classes right now, and
Mm-hmm.
we talk a little bit about incels, and some of them didn't know the term, but I described it, and it's like, oh, that describes my brother, or a lot of them said, or all these other things. And so I think there's like for sure the incels that call
Mm-hmm.
themselves incels, but
Mm-hmm.
there's like strains of entitlement of
Mm-hmm.
like that women's bodies are for my sexual gratification that is permeated throughout beyond the incel community. Incel
Yeah.
community is like the height and the zenith
Mm-hmm.
of women hating in a weird sense, guys. That's like we love women so much, but only for their sexuality, but we also hate women at the same time. So there's so much conflict going on inside there, as well as so much internal conflict. One of the most surprising things prior to doing any research about incel community is that there was a part of me that was like, maybe they're finding some solace and some comfort in like a positive way. That like, yeah, this is not where I want to be. Can I get some help? And the thing is, a lot of them say that they're getting solace, but how they exhibit it on forums is through extreme like degradation of each other. They are super self-deprecating. They insult each other. They argue that it's funny or that's in jokes, but the suicide rate is really high among incels as well. There's a spectrum within the incel community as well. And so going back to my research for a moment, is that for my PhD research, I compared 170 grade 12 boys based on their levels of emotional expression. Because sometimes there's this belief that like, oh, if we tell boys to cry, that's going to save the world. That's obviously hyperbole, but there's the idea that like, oh yeah, if we keep men in touch with their emotions, then they'll be less sexist or homophobic or things like that. And one of the things I measured was to do with that. And there's actually no difference based on your level of emotional expression about whether you have tendencies towards being sexist or homophobic. But what was a very significant difference was their levels of loneliness and feeling like they had to do everything by themselves. And so if you're less willing, like obviously some of it's common sense, if you're less willing to express, emote with other people, even if that's just one person having an emotional safe haven, if you don't have that in your life, you might have lots of friends on the surface level, but their feelings of loneliness are way higher. And I had so many teenage boys who were in that emotionally restricted category who had lots of friends at school, but they admitted to me like, yeah, I don't think any of my friends want to talk about deeper stuff. I wish we could do it like once a year. That would be nice. And I had multiple boys telling me this. And it's like, oh, if you could see each other and see like how similar you are, and that like you feel alone because your emotional experience has been alone and maybe it hasn't been safe for you to express your emotions. I'm not going to pretend like everyone or every time you share vulnerably with someone else, it lands perfectly. It sucks when someone doesn't handle your emotional vulnerability well, and that will make you way more likely to put up a wall and never talk again. And that has happened to a lot of these boys. So I understand that. But at the same time, it's like part of strength, part of a courage is to actually keep on going out there and being vulnerable. Like you can never build safety unless there's a risk at some point. And that's why it's vulnerable. And we know that loneliness and feeling stuck in your situation, hopelessness is one of the biggest predictors of like suicide ideation or suicide. And so with the incel community, and I'm not making this a causal relationship that if you're less emotionally expressive, you're going to be in an incel community, but loneliness for sure is a huge commonality among the people that call themselves black-pilled, is that they blame feminism for empowering women to the extent that they have all the power, and they view themselves as being so ugly that in the past they would have been able to have an ugly girl, but now they care more about money and all these other things that they think is unattainable for them. So they've given up of seeing any way out for themselves. And so they find, yeah, some solace, some connection. It's not the same as like gangs in the sense that gangs are a form of community in real life or in person, face to face, but they find a sense of solace even if they're insulting each other and being super violent in their and abusive in their language. Towards themselves and towards women particularly.
The incels or the gangs or both?
I'm talking about the incels.
The
Gangs
incel.
are another complex thing to talk about.
Yeah. I'm often stunned by the level of what I'll call hierarchical jockeying within incel threads and spaces online. And I think it speaks to domination that you were talking about earlier, right? It's like one way to feel powerful is to try to put other people down. And it's not a physical domination in the same sense, but that sort of social currency domination that happens, I think gives them a little bit of sense of power and control, and can be one way that another part of the restrictive masculinity that is so limiting keeps them stuck in those communities, but also keeps them stuck and isolated and feeling a lot of shame and a lot of hurt probably when they are on the receiving end of that.
Almost all of human behavior is like self-protective in so
Mm-hmm.
many different ways. And so having something like anger, whether that's aimed at women or whether that's aimed at yourself, is protective of feeling what's underneath that anger as well. And so the irony of these incels feeling like they're not enough is they probably don't realize how many people struggle with not feeling enough in their lives as well, to other extents. Like I definitely feel that, of not being enough, not measuring up. And so when you view the hierarchy as like the end all be all, and it's all to do with physicality and
Mm-hmm.
wealth, but they also have a very distorted view of what even physicality is. Like they
Yeah.
think of themselves as so low because it's easier to hate yourself than to actually be like, is there something that needs to change within inside me? Both the things that incels tend to overestimate are things that the red pill community kind of says is changeable. Like work out, make yourself better, business, Bitcoin, do all of these things. That's attainable. And so the black pill is like, wait, this actually isn't attainable. So there's nothing I can change.
Yeah.
Whereas what the research is showing is like what women in relationships often do prioritize is personality,
Yeah.
safety, loyalty, those
Yeah.
things which you very objectively can work on.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just interesting of what they've given into nihilism because they think they have no control over, but they don't realize that how much control they actually do have. But that takes the hard work of looking inward. And boy, when you look inward, there's so much shame, and shame is a terrible emotion to experience and sit with.
Yeah.
But man, is it an important one to do.
It is, and I think the difference between the red pill and the black pill community, in terms of what we're talking about here, is perhaps the red pill community has more capacity for an internalized locus of control, whereas the black pill community feels really helpless and really powerless. So they've really externalized responsibility and control for their livelihood and their experiences in the world to other people, namely women, right? They're holding women responsible for their well-being, which is an exacerbation of sexist thinking, of course, and a continuation of sexist thinking. But it is so disempowering. And I think, to your point earlier, the entitlement is there before somebody gets into that space. But I think that it exacerbates and snowballs the more helpless someone feels, the more victimized by circumstance they feel, the more they feel unable to change what's going on in their life circumstances. I mean, if you really feel that you have so little agency and so little capacity to govern a path in your own life, it can feel like everything is destined to go against you, right? If you feel you have so little agency. So I think like the entitlement piece is really important because a lot of the boys and men who are a part of that black pill, specifically that black pill movement, really feel like they can't affect any change and everyone around them should affect change for them. Let's talk a little bit about sort of how entitlement gets roped into all of that and that externalization of responsibility.
Yeah, that reminds me of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the trauma triangle, where you have the victims, perpetrators, and
Mm-hmm.
rescuers.
Yep.
But yeah, being in that perpetual state of victimhood,
Mm-hmm.
and that women, the chads, feminism are the perpetrators. And I guess the black pill doesn't even have anyone in that rescuer position. Yeah, there really isn't unless they think society changes on a very systemic level. But
Well, maybe
sorry, you were going to
hypothetically,
say.
women are the enablers, right? But they're mad because women aren't
Mm,
enabling. Women are not stepping in and saying, "We want to be with you. We'll give you sex. We'll give you all of the
mm,
social standing that you are hoping for with the ability to quote unquote possess a woman or her attention." And I think that because women are not attracted to the things that they believe women are attracted to, and women are not stepping in to do all of this emotional labor for them, women and feminism then get lumped in with the chads in this perpetrator role. Um, but I do think that they want women to rescue them on some level. And it's a part of why they're so angry and so entitled.
I think you hit the nail on the head. They're both the perpetrator and the rescuer at the same time, but they don't see that happening and they're frustrated because, yeah, their locus of control is nothing to do with them.
Mm-hmm.
I love that you added that on. I started this podcast talking about my background in evangelical Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Is like entitlement was super prevalent
Yeah.
in the messages given to young Christian boys and girls, just even around, yeah, say purity culture, saving yourself from marriage, all these other things. And the sentiment or the idea was like the honeymoon night is like it's kind of for the man. For like
Mm-hmm.
once we've married, then the woman's role in the relationship is like she's gotta keep sex kind of a consistent thing in a man's life because he has needs, and so a man is entitled to a woman's body.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it's not like when you say it that bluntly, a lot of people will be like, no, 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 that's not it at all. It's like
Right.
there's an ebb and flow of different roles that the man does this and the woman does that, and the man has different needs than the woman. But when you boil it down, there's a ton of entitlement that comes within a lot of religious traditions as to what a female's role is, and one of that is for sexual gratification. There was tons of accountability groups growing up around pornography
Mm-hmm.
among men primarily. There was never for the girls generally. It was girls dress modestly. Men, you got to figure out how to not watch porn. That is very prevalent. And so embedded within that is like, oh, if I was having sex or when I get married, then maybe I won't have to struggle with porn again because then my wife's body, my wife, I don't have to be so nihilistic, like someone who I genuinely love, but at the same time is also fulfilling this thing that I haven't worked through or had a relationship with, that this woman is rescuing me. And then later on in marriage, maybe you have some kids, sex isn't being as
Priority.
frequent.
Mm-hmm.
And then that entitlement piece creeps up
Mm-hmm.
again, or it was always there, but becomes louder and louder. That's like a zoomed out version of just one example of how entitlement is embedded in a lot of things.
Sexual entitlement is the start of patriarchy, right? I mean, women were literally promised to men to bear their children, and that was literally how patriarchy was formed. It was to control reproduction by controlling women's bodies and sexual access to them. So it makes a lot of sense what you're saying, that in many religious traditions that are also patriarchal, this has become a focal point, consciously and unconsciously, in how men and women are socialized to exist in relationship with one another.
A counterexample is that in some indigenous cultures, a
Mm-hmm.
part of why there's a clash between colonizers is because they asked like who owns the land,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't have land titles in that way, but like women were
Right.
viewed as mothers of the earth. And
Mm-hmm.
so in the European mindset, it's like, oh, women can't own land. And so
Mm-hmm.
then no one owns this land. And so, yeah, not all histories and traditions are the same in that way,
Mm-hmm.
which is just always
So
good to point
fascinating.
out. That I always find that fascinating too.
Yeah.
But yeah, in the black pill and incel, like the entitlement is at such like a celebrated or high degree that like women cease to be people. Like the dehumanization is so strong to the extent they can't recognize that everything they're espousing is like the antithesis for what would be attractive
Mm-hmm.
for a woman to be romantically inclined with them. And so, yeah, it's really easy to get stuck in a victim mentality. And like in therapy, my understanding of the victim triangle is like the goal isn't to move around. The goal is to get off of the triangle completely.
Yeah, I agree. And but I think when people are unfamiliar with that, or when they're really stuck in sort of their rigid or restrictive ideas of masculinity, the goal might be to be in the perpetrator role, because that gives them a false sense of strength and power. And it can give the illusion of being dominant or being successful. And so it can feel really scary and vulnerable to come off the triangle altogether, because that drama triangle exists to really look at people's relationships with power in relationship. And so when you step off the triangle, you're looking at relationships from a place of equality. right? And respect of each other's agency. And that's a really scary place for people who are used to establishing a sense of self by being one up over other people or one down.
And it's also extremely hard because the reason why you're on that triangle is a good reason, I would argue. The reason why you're first on there is because your life experiences have given you data that supports this conclusion to a certain extent. Like maybe you're missing out on all of the other counter data points, but the ones that you're focused on, or the ones maybe that imprinted or have more of a traumatic memory in your mind and body, like there's a reason for why you're there. And so to actually get off of it, like is often sometimes working through developmental trauma. And it's also like having to get space from your lens and seeing the whole forest of what might exist. And that's really hard.
And it can be, yeah. You talk a lot about the ages of 5 and then again the ages of like 13, 14 being really pivotal times in boys' lives in the sense of like those are pivotal moments where they begin detaching from parts of themselves. Can you talk a little bit about this and how it might, lend some insight into how some boys might be more vulnerable to going down the path of joining incel culture, community, or identifying in that way? And what are some of the things that boys and parents of boys can look out for?
So I would say ages of 5 and around 14 are the two critical time periods when boys start being disconnected from primarily emotional parts of themselves. And the one that happens at age 5 is arguably less conscious. The one that happens around the start of high school is a much more conscious process. So the younger age, very briefly, there's lots of research that prior to that, boys are more emotionally expressive than girls are. They tend to be. Times with school, the socialization pressures or expectations that adults or older siblings have when they go to school is that they start learning already at that age that sadness and fear are less acceptable emotions for boys to emote, that there's certain boy ways of playing and there's certain girls ways of playing, that girls generally are more accepted if they're playing boy things at that age, but the reverse is not true. That generally parents also like self-police their children who are boys from playing with more feminine things more strongly than their daughters playing with boy things. So that's kind of one time period where the fragmentation starts. All the boys that I talked to in my research, this is kind of maybe depressing if you have a son, but all the boys in grade 12, like they said that they all had to suppress their emotions during the start of high school around that time period. Like all of them put on a mask as they're developmentally figuring out like who they are and all these things, and you're switching to a larger school often. So there's way more social posturing and trying to fit in. That makes sense that you're going to hide some parts of yourself that you think aren't going to be as socially accepted. There were the boys that were the most emotionally expressive by grade 12 did say that they were able to have what I called emotional safe havens, whether that was with a parent or like one person during that time period, where they felt like they at least had one relationship where they could be more vulnerable with, or that they knew they could be, but they still, a lot of them took like a couple years to figure that out. That like, you know what, I don't like this mask that I'm putting on. I'm finding friends that like, you know what, I'm testing out the limits of this mask and like I'm trying to reveal more of my face and who I am, and they actually like that. And so yeah, they have had positive experiences with that. So they were able to be more authentically who they felt like they were. And so yeah, that's around the ages of 13, 14, 15, where those pressures are the most severe. But what we know from research too is that the masculinity that you espouse during your teenage years, even if you change that, so if you have a very restrictive masculinity of what you need to be during your teenage years, they've done a major longitudinal study that demonstrates that even if you become more positive masculinity, that you change your ways, is that those teenage years and those beliefs there still correlate with higher levels of drug abuse or drug misuse, alcoholism, depression, mental health things later on in middle age and things like that. So those developmental years when your brain's developing as well is also really important. And so yeah, the first thing I would encourage parents to do, like I would encourage any teacher to do, is like always do the U-turn. You can't teach your children how to handle emotions, how to be emotionally vulnerable if you haven't sat with those parts yourself. And so I think, and I may be jumping around too much, which my brain sometimes tends to do, but I promise you it will connect, is that I'm going to assume that all parents want their children to be resilient.
Mhm.
and to grow up in like being able to navigate the world correctly. And I think the two ends of the continuum here is like one is like, well, let's throw our son into the arena and they'll figure it out and they'll become resilient. And here's the thing, maybe they do become resilient, but they didn't become resilient because they were alone. They became resilient in spite of being alone. And
Mm.
I think for parents, especially for a lot of dads, I'm willing to bet a lot of you were that. You were alone in it and you became resilient out of it. And I think we sometimes think, well, it worked for me. I became resilient that way. And it's like, good job that you had to deal with something hard and you came out through that with some skills and some tools. That doesn't mean that we need to let our teenage boys flounder in the same
Mm.
way. That actually doesn't build resiliency. Resiliency is fostered through guidance, safe connection, and if boys feel like they have some sense of control, autonomy in it as well, which we talk about incels not having that locus of control. They feel like someone else
Mhm.
has that locus of control. So those are
Mm.
like kind of some of the main recipe ingredients for resiliency. And then you have parents on the other end of the continuum who are like, I don't want my son's emotional fragmentation to occur at all. I'm going to protect them from everything else in the world
Mm.
so they never experience anything harmful. And that kind of sheltering, that doesn't build resiliency either, because resiliency isn't fostered through the lack of hardships. It's fostered, you need to have hardships in order to foster resiliency, but you need guidance and care to do that as well. And
Mhm.
so the U-turn for parents to be like, hey, how did I handle emotions? What are the messages I've received about emotions throughout my life? Because if I'm not aware of that, then I'm going to be perpetuating the same cycle,
Mhm.
the same thing that I was received. Or even if I tell my child, yes, you can cry, you can come to me anytime, you can say the right things, but all the research that I've seen as well as I've conducted is like boys are way more impressionable by what people do rather than what they
Mhm.
see. So if they see their dad never crying, it's like, okay, that's
Right.
crying is something I'm not going to do. If you never hear your parents talking about resiliency of a time period where I went through something difficult and how I saw that help. So like that lack of guidance or the need for guidance from parents is paramount or from any adults in their life. So that's a
Mm.
starting place.
I really appreciate you bringing that all together. I think it's most parents really want the best for their kids. And I think a lot of parents have not explored their own upbringing and they haven't really addressed as many of the wounds of that upbringing. So it does leave them with some potential gaps in insight, right, over how they are showing up as individuals in the world and what their kids see instead of what they're sharing and telling their kids. It's really important. The other thing I have read, and I wonder if you've come across this in your research, is that right around age 4 or 5 is when boys start receiving different kinds of interactions from their parents, especially from their fathers, that include less hugs, less physical affection, and less attunement to their emotional process. Whereas that doesn't happen differently. That doesn't change for girls because girls are given permission to feel and emote. And in fact, their emotional landscape is nurtured. But it's around that age when boys start being treated differently. And that can feel like a huge drop and a huge abandonment that they don't know how to reconcile.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why it's so hard, I think, for some parents who've experienced that growing up
Mhm.
to give that to your own child is to kind of admit that you don't like or that it was maybe messed up what happened to you.
Yeah.
Like in order to like actually show up to your kids in the way that would be healing is admitting that something in your own upbringing wasn't ideal.
Yeah.
And it sucks to critique your parents. Like that's hard for a lot of people. That's why children, a boy compared to a daughter or a son compared to a daughter is more likely for their parents to do less physical interactions unless it's wrestling or sports,
Hmm.
but to use less emotional language with their sons than with their daughters. All parents in the research tend to do that as well.
Hmm.
So if you experience that, if a child receives less physical affection or emotional affection from their parent, it's not like that child critiques their parents' parenting style. They
Mm.
critique themselves that I'm not worthy of, or I'm less deserving of physical affection or of love or of emotional care in some way. And in the same way as adults, it's not like it's an easy process to talk to your parents about like, hey, I didn't love some of the ways that you parented me. I think a lot of parents get threatened because they are trying the best they can, and I do genuinely believe that. But if our capacity as parents at whatever age is to hear our children's critiques, not as this is why I hate you, but as like, this is a critique. Can we work through it so that we can repair the rupture and have a connection? I think that's what's so important in repairing intergenerational relationships between children and parents.
I agree. Well, this has been such an insightful conversation about masculinity and about incel culture. And I'm so grateful to you, Dr. Brendan, for coming on the podcast and sharing about your work. Where can people reach you if they want to learn more about what you're working on and if they want to connect with you?
Thank you so much for having me. My website is remasculine.com. So like re-masculine, like regarding masculinity. And there I'm most active on TikTok and Instagram, and my links are all through there.
Great. And we'll include them in the show notes too. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for listening this week. I'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to Get Naked with Dr. Kate. You can follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Dr. Kate Balestrieri and on YouTube at Modern Intimacy. If you have questions you want answered on the podcast, feel free to email me at question@getnakedpodcast.com. Our Modern Intimacy team is here to help you and to provide you with support. Feel free to schedule a free 30-minute consultation at the link in our show notes. And don't forget to join our newsletter for insights, surveys, and articles sent directly to your inbox. You can sign up at modernintimacy.com/newsletter. New episodes drop every Tuesday. I'll see you next week. Disclaimer, this podcast is not a substitute for therapy and does not constitute a professional relationship with me, Dr. Kate, or with Modern Intimacy. This podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only.